So before the break, we brought you the story of Queen Victoria as part of our new series, Stories Behind the Statues. And part of that conversation is highlighting lesser known figures who deserve more recognition than they ever received. One of those is Basil Johnston. He was a survivor of abuse within the residential school system. He later used his incredible talent for writing to elevate Indigenous culture and to push for reconciliation before it was a common term talking about Indigenous relations. Joining us with more this morning is Professor of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba, Negan Sinclair. Thanks for being with us today.
Bonjour, hello.
Hello.
Good morning.
Basil Johnston, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. Yeah.
Great. I wanted you to introduce the rest of the country to Basil Johnston. He had an incredibly challenging childhood. Tell us about some of his earlier years.
So Basil Johnston was born in a time period in the 1920s where Indigenous peoples were not, very much under the control of the Canadian state. They were very much in a position in which they were frequently told that they were savages, and so he was removed to residential school at a very early age. And despite being sexually and physically abused for most of his life, turned and lived in Toronto with other residential school survivors, and turned to a method of peace that we would now call reconciliation, but was way before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was way at a time period where, frankly, Indigenous peoples had no reason to believe in any hope in Canada, but still had the audacity to believe in a relationship with Canadians, and began to work in the Royal Ontario Museum in the 1970s after being a teacher for a while, worked 25 years at the Royal Ontario Museum, delivered stories to millions and millions of people by publishing very many books. And, in many ways did more for reconciliation than any Canadian politician has ever done in history, than most Indigenous leaders have done. And for very much, most of us are living in the shadow now.
Yeah, and for some of that work, he was also awarded the Order of Ontario. And you mentioned him as an author in an era when books were rarely written by Indigenous authors. He managed to push out works that became early classics all the way back in the 70s, including Ojibwe Heritage and Moose Meat and Wild Rice. What makes him such an important figure to you personally? Because you knew him.
Yeah, he used to phone me all the time. And one of the things he would always say is, when you're growing up as an Indigenous person in the country, it can be very frustrating. It can be very angering. And he always tried to make me laugh. And he was always a guy that saw the hope in things and saw the positivity in things. I think, like many residential school survivors, he had wisdom beyond seeing the typical violence that I know we've been speaking a little bit about Queen Victoria earlier, that the kind of colonial authorities brought to our communities, and in very many ways gave us no hope, actually gave Canadians no hope, frankly, gave the ability to only think of Indigenous peoples as peoples you take lands from, as people you shuffle onto the river and forget about forever, and generally are savages and uncivilized people. Basil refused to believe in that and believed in humor. He also believed in the audacity of language and culture. He spent most of his life not only just telling stories, but also translating legal terms into Indigenous languages, for the most part because he believed so deeply in the importance of Indigenous peoples understanding the law. And he also was a fierce advocate for believing in love. His wife very much brought him to a position in which he had a great deal of peace and understanding by the end of his life about what it would take to step into the future. Yes.
Megan, I love learning so much more about him, and I want to thank you for bringing information about Basil Johnston to the rest of the country and for highlighting him as being at the fore of this work of reconciliation. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, Miigwech, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. If you like this, be sure to subscribe here.
And you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.